21 years ago, on January 4th, 2004, at 4:35 spacecraft event time, a golf cart-sized extension of humanity bounced onto the surface of Mars in a cocoon of airbags. And the marvel that emerged from that cocoon would go on to redefine our understanding of our planetary neighbor and become an international superstar. The little rover that was called Spirit became known for its, well, spirit, operating for some 25 times its anticipated lifespan. But today, nearly 15 years after the little rover went silent, it still deserves to be remembered. Mars is easily observable without a telescope. In fact, it is one of the brightest objects in the Earth's sky, and it will be brightest in 2025 in January, when it will be closest to Earth. In the northern hemisphere, look for it just above the eastern horizon around 8 p.m., whereas in the southern hemisphere, it will show on the northeast horizon. The planet is reddish, owing to the prevalence of iron oxide, and when conditions are right, it will appear red even when viewed by the naked eye. Gary Polakovic of the University of Southern California noted the hold that our planetary partner has had on humanity since time immemorial. Throughout human history, Mars has been embraced in myths, religion, literature, and cinema. It's been an icon for nations, a spot on the calendar, an erotic symbol, a god of warfare, and the potential home of little green men. Mars has been studied by astronomers for millennia. Bohan Novakovic of Belgrade University, writing in the publications of the Astronomical Observatory of Belgrade in 2008, notes that the astronomer, mathematician, and architect Sennemut produced a star map during the reign of Queen Hatshepsut more than 3,500 years ago. Notably, Mars is portrayed as a boat going backwards, demonstrating that Sennemut had calculated that Mars was in retrograde. Chinese astronomers made clear notation of Mars near the beginning of the first millennium BC. Babylonian astronomers made careful calculations of the motions of planets in the middle first millennium BC, developing calculations to track locations of the known planets. The website Starlight explains that Mars is seen close to the horizon, and observation will move to a point where the planet falls below the horizon. This might represent to the Babylonians a descent into the underworld, and might be why the planet came to be associated with Nergal, the Mesopotamian god of the underworld, who, while associated with death and disease, Nergal was also the god of war. Mars was well known to Greek astronomers and mentioned by Aristotle. As Greek astronomy was influenced by the Mesopotamians, that is likely how the planet came to be associated with the Greek god of war, Ares, which was then carried over to the Romans as Mars. The planet's reddish color likely reinforced the association, which remained over time, famously represented in the first movement of composer Gustav Holst's seven-movement orchestral suite, The Planets, entitled Mars, the Bringer of War, composed between 1914 and 1917. More detailed observation of Mars required a telescope, and Galileo was observing Mars with his telescope as early as 1610. But while astronomers over time began to well understand the movement of planets, they still knew little about them. Even in the 19th century, it was commonly believed that the planets had creatures living on them. This led particularly to an assumption that there was a civilization on Mars. Smithsonian Magazine explains in 1877, Giovanni Schiaparelli, an Italian astronomer, reported seeing canali on the surface of Mars. When his report was translated into English, canali, which in Italian means channels, was rendered as canals, which are by definition man made. But the most famous observer of these canals was American astronomer Percival Lowell, Smithsonian continues. Lowell's imagination was ignited by Schiaparelli's findings. In 1894, Lowell built an observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona, and focused on Mars. Other astronomers had noticed that some of the areas of the planet's surface seemed to change with the seasons, blue-green in the summer and reddish ochre in the winter. These changes seemed to correspond with the growing and shrinking of the polar ice caps. Lowell believed that the melting caps in summer filled the canals with water that fed large areas of vegetation. He filled notebook after notebook with observations and sketches and created globes showing the vast network of waterways built by Martians. As these features changed with time, Lowell was convinced that some civilization was still actively constructing the canals. The observations piqued the imagination, Smithsonian writes. Like any romantic idea, belief in Martian canals proved hard to abandon. The possibility of life on the planet closest to ours has fascinated us for centuries and continues to do so. Lowell's canals inspired science fiction writers, including H.G. Wells and Ray Bradbury. H.G. Wells' classic work War of the Worlds, written in 1898, famously features an attack on Earth by Martians. The general belief that there was a civilization on Mars was reinforced with bizarre stories in newspapers, such as one in the Becker, Minnesota Tomahawk in 1920 that suggested that radio inventor Guglielmo Marconi was receiving radio communication from Mars, and that such signals had also been detected in Australia and England. The article quoted Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison as supporting the idea that people on other planets were trying to contact us. An article in Answers magazine in 1906 also referenced Marconi, suggesting that communication could be made with Mars via heliograph and speculating that the canals seen by Lowell were proof that Mars included a civilization that could communicate back. The public belief in the Martian canal seems to have well outlasted scientific confidence, as other astronomers were unable to discern the canals that Lowell mapped so carefully. Smithsonian concludes, to this day, no one knows whether Lowell's maps were the result of fatigue, optical illusions, or perhaps the pattern of blood vessels in his eye. But even as there was less confidence in discovering little green men, Mars continued to fascinate during the space age. Mars is comparatively close and accessible, and as with any race, there was an amount of prestige in being the first to reach the planet, which has much scientific potential being rocky, with diverse geography, and like Earth, rotates on its axis, making for day and night cycles similar to Earth. Between 1960 and 1962, the Soviet Union planned 5 different missions for spacecraft to visit Mars, but all failed. Likewise, NASA's Mariner 3 suffered a launch failure in November of 1964 before its twin, Mariner 4, successfully flew by Mars in 1965. The subject of another episode of the History Guy, Mariner 4, among other discoveries, finally disproved the idea that there were canals constructed on Mars. But by then, life on Mars had a different meaning. Closer observation suggested that there may once have been liquid water on Mars, making Mars the most likely other planet in the solar system that may once have generated life. And Mars also offers the tantalizing possibility that it could be terraformed and colonized. But a further understanding of Mars required more than a flyby, and NASA first succeeded landing on the planet with the Viking 1 lander on July 20th, 1976. The Viking 1 lander operated from the surface of Mars for nearly 6 years until November 1982, while the Viking 1 orbiter returned more than 57,000 images of the red planet. What Viking did not do is bring back clear evidence of current or past life on Mars. Mars missions slowed. NASA didn't attempt another Mars mission for 17 years, but it was a discovery on Earth that reinvigorated interest in Mars, as explained in a 2024 edition of Space.com. Interest in Mars was rekindled in the 1980s and 90s as researchers on Earth uncovered microbes not only surviving but also thriving in the extreme environments of underwater volcanic vents. This discovery was exciting because Viking pictures showed possible evidence that the area had had water in the past. NASA was searching for evidence of water in Mars's past to help determine whether the planet once did, or might still, host life. Mars Global Surveyor, launched in 1996, was an orbital spacecraft that would be used to locate potential sites where evidence of water might be found. But to investigate those sites, NASA needed more than an orbiter or even a lander. They needed an ability to search. They needed a rover. NASA landed the first rover on Mars on Independence Day, 1997. Launched December 4th, 1996, the Mars Pathfinder mission tested several concepts, notably methods of more economical exploration programs, as well as the use of airbag cushioned landing. The lander, named after astronomer Carl Sagan, took atmospheric measurements as the probe descended and then kept meteorological data. But it also carried with it Sojourner, named after the abolitionist Sojourner Truth. The 26-pound, foot-tall vehicle was the first rover successfully landed on the red planet and gave an ability to closely investigate the features nearby the Carl Sagan Memorial Station. Sojourner included cameras and an X-ray spectrometer to determine the composition of the Martian surface. Sojourner was designed to operate for 7 Martian days, or sols, but successfully operated for 92 sols, or about 95 Earth days. And between them, the Pathfinder base and the rover returned more than 2.3 billion bits of information, including over 16,500 images, and Sojourner provided analysis of 15 different samples while traveling a total of about 330 feet. The success of the rover was important, as it was a test of whether the vehicle design could navigate the Martian surface, even though little was yet known about that surface. Among its discoveries were rounded pebbles and cobbles that suggested that Mars was once much wetter and warmer, with stable surface water, an environment much more amenable to life. A second rover, named after Marie Curie, was created as a backup, now resides at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. But the 26-pound rover was really a test of concept, and 330 feet is a very small part of Mars. The next and more ambitious goal was to land a far more capable rover, or rather, two of them. The Mars Exploration Rover mission, or MER, would send rovers to opposite sides of the planet, intended to learn much more about the geology of Mars and investigate specific areas identified in other missions. A naming contest was held, sponsored by NASA and the LEGO Corporation. Out of nearly 10,000 entries, the winning essay was written by an Arizona third grader named Sophie Collins. The two rovers were called Spirit and Opportunity. These twin rovers were sent with several scientific objectives in mind, but key, according to NASA, was to search for a range of rocks and soil types and then look for clues for past water activity on Mars. The rovers would also generally determine the distribution and composition of rocks and soils on Mars. In addition, being on the ground allowed the rovers to directly validate assessments made from orbiters, testing the accuracy of the science collected from space. The two identical new rovers had far more scientific capability than Sojourner, carrying not just an array of cameras, but three types of spectrometers, a rock abrasion tool that could be used to dig into rock to see below the surface, and a magnet to draw magnetic iron from the soil. Each rover weighed 384 pounds, 7 times the weight of Sojourner, and was expected to operate for 90 sols, or about 94 Earth days. The entire cost of the primary mission was 820 million US dollars. There was difficulty in negotiating landing sites, as NASA explains. The places most appealing to scientists, like the side of a cliff, for example, on which the planet's history is recorded in layers and sedimentary rock, are often the most frightening to engineers charged with the robot's safety. Space.com writes that the decision on the best landing sites for Spirit and Opportunity was itself a 2 year negotiation. Launched nearly a month apart in June and July of 2003, both landed without problems using the balloon cocoon tested by Mars Pathfinder. Hitting the surface at a velocity of some 46 feet per second, Spirit bounced 28 times before rolling to a stop, yet was undamaged. Opportunity landed in a shallow crater, prompting NASA to announce in a press release that they had scored a 300 million mile interplanetary hole in one. Although solar powered, the six-wheeled machines carried a small radioisotope heater, a tiny nuclear reactor that produces heat through radioactive decay, warming critical systems during the night when temperatures can drop to minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The mission was not without its difficulty. On January 21st, Spirit stopped transmitting because of an issue with its flash memory. NASA scientists were able to reformat the memory and correct the problem. Traversing terrain on another world via commands from Earth certainly had its challenges. Opportunity once got stuck on a 12-inch high sand dune, and NASA had to test solutions on a model in a sandbox to finally extricate it. Spirit's front right wheel ceased functioning, and NASA had to drive the rover backwards, dragging the wheel. But that problem offered, well, opportunity, as the drag wheel exposed bright silica rich dust that indicated contact between soil and water. However, by the time of these missteps, most rovers had already operated well beyond their original mission, which should have ended in March of 2004. Spirit even got a boost from the Martian weather. The solar powered rovers received less and less solar energy as the panels became obscured by Martian dust. But in March of 2005, fully a year beyond when its mission was supposed to end, passing dust devils, a phenomenon that had been witnessed by Mars' global surveyor, swept dust from the top of the solar panels and increased power coming to Spirit from the usual 60% to 93%. At other times, however, dust storms obscured the panels, while wind would occasionally blow dust off. The Martian weather proved as capricious a challenge as weather is to science here on Earth. Even when Spirit finally became stuck, it still performed its mission of science. Stuck in sinking sand, efforts to extricate the rover revealed strata that included sand with basalt, sulfate, and silica in it, making the hole in which Spirit had become stuck one of the most interesting places Spirit has been, according to a NASA press release. But Spirit was unable to escape the trap, and its last transmission came on March 22nd, 2010. By then, Spirit had operated for more than 6 years. And Opportunity was still going. When its flash memory drive failed in 2014, NASA was able to make the rover operate from its random access memory, or RAM. Opportunity's last message to Earth was in June of 2018, finally done in by a massive dust storm that apparently obscured its solar panels. Over their extraordinary mission life, the rovers achieved important milestones, including the first images of Earth from Mars, the first time that Earth had been photographed from the surface of another planet other than the Moon. But in terms of science, the two rovers accomplished their primary mission of searching for evidence of water on Mars. While finding no direct evidence that life had existed on Mars, they did discover strong evidence that Mars had once been a wet environment with conditions that could have supported microbial life. These two rovers that so exceeded their life expectancy sent back to us some 300,000 pictures of the red planet. And not only did they redefine our understanding of that planet, but they helped prepare us for future missions, including two new rovers, Ingenuity and Perseverance, which landed on Mars in 2020. And Perseverance is still, well, persevering. And if you were one of the many who got caught up in rooting for these indomitable golf carts in space, it's hard to imagine that Spirit and Opportunity could be forgotten. But if you were born the day that Spirit landed on Mars, well, tomorrow, you'll be old enough to drink, and you probably little remember Spirit and Opportunity. But the accomplishment of operating for years these vehicles on a distant and often hostile planet with which humanity has been fascinated for some 3.5 millennia, well, that deserves to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.